Here's hoping that this week's video ends up shorter than last week's video was, because that ended up being a little bit of a doozy. Welcome to the Book Binge. I am your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and last week's aforementioned video was a discussion on why literary fiction matters in the reading sphere of today. More than that, last week I also started to make the case for why you should probably try checking out a little bit more classics, a little bit more literary fiction, and not completely dominating your entire TBR with only modern genre fiction releases. Additionally, I also tried to explain a little bit how literary fiction and classics are a little bit more approachable than I think certain people make them out to be for themselves, not least because of poor experiences in school. In a sense, I also went about validating fart sniffers and snobs in that video, but no more of that, because this week I'm going to justify why we should be reading genre fiction as well. Everything from science fiction and fantasy, to horror and thrillers, to mysteries and romance, and whatever else may have you. All of that stuff makes for a great and diverse TBR, and I think that that is an actively good thing. We should not only read literary fiction, and we should not only read genre fiction. I think there is a healthy balance of both. So let's talk a little bit more deeply about all of that. But first off, we should probably define what genre fiction actually is. And genre tends to mean different things to different people, most particularly of note Christopher Rocchio, who dominates the top shelf of my bookshelf right back there, and a couple other shelves that I don't even have in video frame anymore, does not believe in genre the way that modern audiences do, but for the sake of simplicity, I will talk about genre in the way that modern audiences would typically think of them. In the modern world, it is pretty obvious that most reading is of the genre variety. To me, genre fiction usually comes with subsets of tropes and other predictable material that makes it pretty obvious what somebody is going to be getting into within a spectrum whenever they pick up a book of said genre, and therefore is an easy way to recommend and pick up books of particular varieties based off of what you kind of know you tend to enjoy, and even to broaden your horizons, it can be a little bit easier as well. I believe that there are certain tones, certain learning curves, certain tropes, obviously, as I mentioned before, and other stuff of this type that we tend to expect from any given genre, and sometimes we can predict degrees of prose quality and other certain storytelling quality and ascribe that to particular genres in certain, like, say, decades of when they were written as well, but some of that gets a little bit more in the weeds and isn't really pertinent to today's conversation. What I'm trying to get at is that genre fiction, in a sense, you know what you're getting into for the most part. That is the broader point that I'm making. For example, in epic fantasy, you might expect a deep world, a lot of characters, a relatively high learning curve because there's a lot of new terminology specific to that world, specific to those characters. There's going to be a lot of that kind of stuff that maybe makes these books a little bit longer because there's more detail to kind of all of that information. In sci-fi, and I know I hold up a science fantasy book that's kind of skirts between those two realms, but it was just an easy option to grab off the top of my head. In science fiction, you may expect a little bit more of a tech focus, or a space focus, or an idea focus, because there's multiple different types of sci-fi. This is a little bit more of that kind of space focus, and it's also kind of fantasy-esque. Michael Crichton might be a little bit more of the technology-esque, and then a lot of classic sci-fi might be a little bit more of the idea focus, but you can have any combination of these really, and those are going to be like your dominant traits of science fiction. In horror, you might expect any variety of psychological dread or certain monster flicks or slashers or whatever you might have. Stephen King has material in basically all of these regards. I would say The Shining is a little bit more of a psychological focus. I would say that It by Stephen King is more of a monster flick, so to speak, since you have a lot of that It, the clown kind of thing going on. Stephen Graham Jones has a lot of books that are more of that slasher variety, so you can have variety within genres, but you might expect some of any of those types of varieties when you're picking up horror. In something more like a thriller, and I'm holding a little bit more of a suspense book than maybe a proper thriller. I haven't actually read this book yet, but it is the closest thing on my bookshelves that I could find that might actually fit the term thriller. So, you know, just go with me here. In thrillers, you might expect a faster pace, plus a narrative that tends to invoke a chase sequence or something thereabouts. In mysteries, you might expect a mystery, obviously, that you're going to try to solve along with the characters, or that you're looking forward to the solution of to explain the entire plot, because mysteries are baked into the entire plot, and the reveal will tend to make everything clear, and that's what you're looking for in mysteries. In westerns, you might expect something like cowboys, old six-shooters, deserts, old-timey American West feel, the kind of thing that you might expect from a spaghetti western film is kind of the stereotype of what you might expect from a western. And then, of course, you have something that maybe isn't the best example of a quote-unquote romance, but this is probably the most romance book that I have on my shelves off the top of my head. But in romances, you might expect a form of love-forward plotline with dramatic twists associated with it. So basically any genre that you can think of, there is a subset of tropes and other identifiable material that makes it generally pretty easy to tell what genre that is a part of. Lines can get a little bit blurry, and as I said, there are some variations, there are subgenres to some of these things, like fantasy, a bunch of different types of fantasy between grimdark and just general epic fantasy and urban fantasy and portal fantasy. You know, there's a whole bunch of different types of things that can increase the variety of what a genre has to offer, but you know what I'm getting at. There are subsets of things that you come to expect from those types of books, and therefore makes it easy to pick up and recommend and even avoid them on account of those things. But kind of how I mentioned there, variety, even genre fiction obviously has a lot of variety to it. Last week, recall that I had said that there is an inherent variety that comes with a genre like literary fiction, a genre that is pretty vague, that doesn't really describe a set of tropes, but rather the absence of those kinds of tropes. Given that literary fiction is usually trying to buck or deconstruct some of the things that you might expect from other genres, there are relatively few tangible bounds to define what that genre is. You know, it's one of those things that if you want something that is different from any of the genre books you're reading, literary fiction is a place that you can go for something that is unlike anything else that you are likely to read, or unlike a lot of other stuff that you are likely to read anyway. In a sense, literary fiction isn't really a genre, and classics as a genre is even less defined because that's more based off of age of a book rather than any defining quality. But like I was getting into just a little bit before, genre fiction also has a ton of variety to it. But instead of having variety because there is not a subset of tropes to define what that genre is, rather there's a whole bunch of different subsets of tropes that themselves create a whole diverse set of things that you could read. To me, there are various categories even within genres that aren't even subgenres as well. We kind of went into already a little bit of the subgenre idea, where fantasy has various different things that are going on with it. Science fiction also has various different focuses that it can have. Horror can have various different focuses. Any genre can have multiple different subgenres, and any genre can also blend in or mold with other genres to create something a little bit more unique. A personal favorite book that I have read so far this year was Red Rabbit by Alex Grecian, which is a Western horror novel, and at that got a little bit of historical fiction energy in there as well. So you have an amalgamation of different tropes and ideas that come to create something a little bit more fresh. But even more than subgenres, I also think that there are various categories of books that are kind of unrelated to genre. This can be things like cozy books. For a particular thing of note is like cozy mysteries, where there's not super high stakes. It's probably not associated with any like serious topic like murder or anything crazy like that. More just a simple, you know, let's say family-friendly type of mystery. You can have cozy books like that, or even cozy books in another way that are just like an easy, short read for an afternoon rather than something more lengthy or in-depth, something that might take too long to read. Shorter books, as I mentioned, can often make their own kind of category of reads. YA-oriented type of material can also be its own form of category, even if it's not technically really a category in a proper sense. There's also stuff on the longer end, more complex stuff, comparing, for example, something like Ranger's Apprentice, which is a little bit more YA oriented, a little bit quicker, easier, simpler, easier to digest, and is probably more in a classic type of variety. Gardens of the Moon or Steven Erikson, Malazan in general, something that is renowned for being a little bit more complex. Just a lot of stuff going on, a lot of details, a lot of little things to kind of keep track of, and these can kind of show you the differences in variety. You can have something that's shorter and easier. You can have something that's longer and more complex. You can also have material that's more thematically oriented on this side of the spectrum. So, even within any given genre, you can have a wide spectrum of focus, whether that be short, quick, and easy and cozy, or something that's meant to be dug into a little bit more. That was something that I briefly got into last week, and which we will get into a little bit more this week, in that you don't have to go to literary fiction to get something that is more, how shall we say, intellectually stimulating, even though that term, that way that I put that, probably sounds a little bit more pretentious. That's the word that I'm looking for. Saying intellectually stimulating is probably something that sounds a little bit pretentious, but what I'm getting at is you don't have to go to literary fiction to get something that is more intellectually stimulating, because genre fiction can very well have some material of that variety as well, and that's part of what this video is going to try to argue. In short, there's going to be something for everybody within some kind of genre somewhere, whether that be more complex and less popcorny, or whether that be sheer entertainment and more popcorny. And on the topic of calling books popcorn, that is itself a particular category of genre fiction, usually, which is a variety of quick, easy, and short reads that are pretty easy to pick up and put down, and some of them of the variety that you pick up, put them down when you're done just to forget them, because they're not going to be something that's going to stick in your mind forever. Just a quick, easy, entertaining type of read that you're reading primarily for the ease or primarily for the entertainment. Popcorn books also are pretty good at being slump busters. They're great for getting you out of a reading slump, because quick, easy entertainment sheerly for the value of entertainment, sometimes that's all that you need. Whether that book be a little bit more cinematic or simply cozy, doesn't really matter. Popcorn is a great category of fiction. So just as I did with literary fiction last week, I think that there is great variety inherent to reading in any particular genre that you want to, and that is okay. If you don't want to read fantasy today, cool, there are plenty of other genres, plenty of other options that you can choose from. You're tired of your old reliable genre reads, like you normally read sci-fi fantasy, but you want something a little bit different? Cool, there's a bunch of different stuff that you could read instead, like horror and thrillers, even romance, mysteries, whatever have you. There's a whole bunch of different stuff out there for you to give a shot, even if you're tired of reading some of the stuff that you've been reading a little bit more over recent times. Heck, you can even read multiple genres each month to kind of keep things from getting stale, like say reading a fantasy book, a sci-fi book, a western book, and a horror book all in the same month, and making sure you get one of each of those every month might be a way to kind of rotate through some genres so that things never really feel old. I don't know how you specifically tend to function, but that is something that is available to you. That is an option that you can go with. But let's circle back around to that popcorn idea that I kind of discussed a little bit earlier. I want to make the point that saying genre fiction, and more specifically popcorn variety genre fiction, should not be an insult. Snobs can definitely ruin things for a lot of people. That just tends to be a rule of life, no matter where you exist on the world or on the internet, wherever it may be. Lit bros may insist that non-literary fiction is all garbage and brain rot nonsense. Fart sniffers will definitely read their postmodern indecipherable drivel and nothing else and think that anybody who reads anything else is wasting their time. And legitimate elitists will insist that their own nostalgia loves genre fiction from their childhood is different and that's actually okay stuff, but that everything else is garbage. And then will also insist things that like magical realism and stuff are inherently superior to your fantasy books, specifically to make themselves feel better about their reading choices or any other entertainment medium for that matter. It is simply a fact of life that disrespectful people will decide that certain books aren't worthy, often arbitrarily, and it becomes altogether far too easy and common for the popcorn slang that we've kind of adopted for certain types of entertainment-focused media to be a derogatory term. And popcorn should not be a derogatory term, in my opinion. I do not believe that that is the case, and I think that popcorn, just as everything else, has its place in the media landscape. So, how to respond to crap like that when you have elitists kind of coming at you for what you choose to consume? Well, I mean, it's pretty easy. You can either just ignore them until they shut up, or just don't let them get away with it, because we all know that thick-skulled weirdos can definitely ruin the fun for everybody else, and I'm making this video to assure you that, well, you don't have to be the fart sniffer if you don't want to. You don't have to read the literary fiction if you don't want to. I urge you to, because there's a lot of great stuff over there, but don't feel bad for reading genre fiction either. Reading a whole variety of stuff is a good thing, actually, and you should not be ashamed for reading what sounds interesting and fun to you. I know this is a revolutionary idea, for sure, but what elitists and fart sniffers and general no-fun weirdos have to say doesn't really matter that much, and if you want to have fun sometimes, and even if you want to be able to read a book that you can completely turn your brain off to and never remember anything about beyond the day after you finished it, that is okay. If that's how you want to spend your time, and you think that that is good for you, do it. It's fine. You know, you don't have to intellectually stimulate yourself with something really complex and deep every day if you do not want to. So that's the defense of popcorn genre fiction, but now I want to change tack a little bit and tell you that genre fiction doesn't have to just be simple, mindless, pick it up and throw it away garbage. Genre fiction can also be analyzed, actually. An important thing to note is that genre fiction is not inherently meritless. Popcorn variety fiction may be a thing that exists and may be a colloquial categorization that we all kind of use on and off, but that doesn't mean that there is nothing to it and that there is nothing worth getting out of genre fiction, broadly speaking. This may come as a surprise to some, but that is definitely the case. And while we're still on that topic of popcorn books, even popcorn books can have great material in them. We'll talk about all of this in its due time. Do not disregard the fact that tons of genre fiction can contain deeply human truths and stuff like that as well. You do not have to read literary fiction to be able to get books that explore the human condition, that explore empathy and human pathology and evil and various different types of topics in good and deep and even thought-provoking, like super thought-provoking ways. That is not something that is incapable of being covered in genre fiction. In fact, a lot of what makes genre fiction fun, depending on what types of stuff you read, is that plenty of this material, plenty of these genres, plenty of these books that fit within a certain genre, fit within that genre to be able to use those tropes to tell a deeper human truth. They're specifically working within a given and understandable and easily comprehensible framework to tell something deeper. And a lot of authors do that, so to completely disregard genre fiction as something that doesn't contain human truth would simply be silly. Literally, any writing can contain a piece of an author's soul within it, and furthermore, any fiction can be designed to be parsed through endlessly. It does not matter if it's using certain tropes to do that. These things are not mutually exclusive, and to insist that fantasy or science fiction or in horror or anything like that is inherently lesser is very short-sighted and stupid. So let me provide a couple of examples to prove my point a little bit. I'll try my best to pick out the right ones here in a timely fashion. Sun Eater has proved incredibly rich for me on rereads because of the intricacy of the foreshadowing and how it explores Hadrian's character as the narrator, both in the past and in the present. Ton of stuff in Sun Eater that is super worth rereading on account of some of this deeper material, and that makes that reading experience incredibly fun for me. You know, fun in that genre fiction kind of way, but also contains, like I said, some of those deeper human psychological truths that Christopher is exploring through Hadrian and other characters as well, but particularly through Hadrian, that makes Sun Eater worth reading for more than just being a space opera. Lord of the Rings is a pretty obvious example of a scholar creating a wonderful world in and of itself, and also is a part of the genre of fantasy that kind of blends in with classics, because this stuff is pretty old at this point, and classics are not inherently separate from genre fiction, which in and of itself should tell you that genre fiction is not necessarily a bad thing. You also have authors like Philip Chase, who prove that there is tons to get out of fantasy, broadly speaking, and not just within his writing. Philip Chase has his own booktube channel and does a lot of analyzing fantasy specifically. Like, his YouTube tag is literally at Philip Chase, the best of fantasy, and he teaches a course in a college about fantasy literature, not just classic literature or other older, generally more time-worn stuff. He literally teaches a fantasy course, which in and of itself should tell you that there is plenty to get out of fantasy, even though it's not literary fiction, quote unquote. One of my favorite authors, whom I don't have a book for, on the floor over here from last week's video, Percy Jackson, Rick Riordan stuff, makes mythology, you know, classic philosophy and religious ideals from very long time ago in a different kind of world, makes that kind of material fun and reflects morals, even in a modern sense. You can have various different aspects of this that make some of those ideas and some of those concepts fun and interesting, an easy way to look at them from the vantage of younger audiences. And heck, Percy Jackson doesn't even have to just be read by younger audiences, but particularly for its target demographic in that sort of middle grade and then early high school range, middle grade YA, and then for some of the sequel stuff, more of a high school age. Some of that stuff has great material to explore as well. And, you know, I think that some of these books would actually not make a bad assigned reading for school, for example, compared to certain classics. I already mentioned Crichton a little bit earlier, which a lot of Crichton's science fiction work tends to ask prescient questions about human nature in regards to tech, how we work with tech, and how we can sometimes push things a little bit too far in short-sightedness and out of hubris. Jurassic Park is a great example of this. We all know that famous quote, which I'm going to paraphrase here. You got so excited with the fact that you could do something that you didn't stop to think about whether you should do something. So there are deeper truths that can be explored within that kind of science fiction as well. Even Wheel of Time, a book that I held up earlier, seriously ponders some given tropes in relatively interesting ways. It's kind of that bridge in between classic fantasy and modern fantasy because of exploring what it means to truly be the chosen one and what that actually requires of you. And so that's something that can be pretty interesting. Hell, I haven't even talked about comics or manga up to this point, but comics and manga and graphic novels can have really great stuff as well because, well, you know, they're still telling their own stories, and sometimes they're just telling other stories within a different medium. And kind of the same thing as with gaming and film and TV and that kind of stuff. Just because those stories are told in a visual medium does not mean that they do not have that kind of worth in them. So there's definitely a lot of variety that can be inherent to some of this stuff. Kind of on that idea, like I was saying, of like assigned reading in a school, like for Percy Jackson. Where is the book at? I Am Number 4 was a book that we were assigned to read in my 8th grade English class. And the reason why our teacher did that, she was a little bit younger as well. So like she kind of understood the pain of being young kids in the modern world having to read dusty old classics. She assigned this in 8th grade because there was actually in this YA book some deeper truths to human nature and stuff that was fun to explore and talk about in an English literature class kind of way, you know, in that kind of context, and be able to talk about that. Sure, the school-related assignments that we had to do for the book were the least enjoyable part of reading the book, but the fact that we got to read a book that I personally read in all but one night for an English assignment was something that was really cool. So there's definitely a case to be made for genre fiction and things like that being used as a mechanism to explore deeper truths and stuff that can be analyzed if you want to analyze it that way, that not all of it is just brain dead garbage. And in fact, a lot of it is not just brain dead garbage. But I think that the example that I really want to get into today is the one that really got me thinking about doing this topic this year, even though I've had this idea for quite a while, a couple of years at this point. Pillars of the Earth. The majority of this video has kind of implicitly been a commentary on one particular friend of mine who is a very, how shall we say, opinionated and kind of has a bad habit of treating everybody's opinions as silly or stupid or wrong if they are not also his opinions. And he does it in the kind of snobbish type of way. And Pillars of the Earth is a relatively decent example for me to be able to use for the purposes of today's discussion. This friend of mine, who I've been, you know, kind of poking at implicitly throughout this video, rated Pillars of the Earth 3 out of 5. While that in and of itself is not the most offensive thing, if you didn't love Pillars of the Earth, that's fine. It's one of my favorite books of all time at this point, but you don't have to love it. But the reason he rated this 3 out of 5 was simply because it's fine. He called it popcorn 3 out of 5, and that was basically all he had to say about it. But knowing this guy, I am so incredibly shocked that some of the deeper meaning that can be gleaned from this book, meaning that I got from it when I read it pretty recently, I'm very surprised that all of that did not also click for him. Seriously, this is a guy who gets very standoffish about his personal values, and this book has very rich discussionary material in regard to those values in ways that is very shocking that he would read this and be like, it's okay, it's just popcorn, you know, like nothing really more than just popcorn, that's all that it is. And it's like, no, actually, that is not all that Pillars of the Earth is. I don't want to get into this too horribly deeply for the purposes of today's video to kind of keep this a little bit shorter, not least because I've already reviewed this book and have various other videos where I've talked about it before, but I think that if you read this book and get no lessons or broader reflections on human nature, I seriously have to wonder if we even read the same book at that point. Books like Pillars of the Earth prove that there is something rich in books that are relatively easy to read. This book may be long, but it is very quick. I, a very slow reader, got through this in just a few weeks. This is the length of a book that might ordinarily take me an entire month. If it was the only book I read, it instead only took me a few weeks, and there was about a week of that time where I was reading another book as well. So that kind of goes to show how quick this is, how smooth of a read it is. A book does not have to be hard to read, and a book does not have to completely bend your brain over backwards just to be worth reading. Something that is easy can still have great stuff in it. I think when it comes to themes, the Pillars of the Earth is a particularly great example of this. There's a lot of exploration of generational family trauma. There's a lot of exploration on love and our duty to do it, our duty to love people. There's a lot of stuff on sexual violence and how that affects both the perpetrator and the victim, as like kind of where some of the darker themes can get into things. And then there's, of course, a lot of the theological and religious type of ideas that are explored in surprisingly subtle and respectful ways, despite Ken Follett, I'm pretty sure, not being a Christian. At least he wasn't practicing at the time that he wrote this book, for sure. I have no idea what his actual religious philosophy is, but he treated a lot of those topics with a respect that allowed for great exploration of those topics to come from the book. And I think that that's really, really good. There's also some other stuff that I'm not going to get into in this video, but this book is the one example to me that is proof that popcorn, quote unquote, can be and sometimes is something greater just inherently. This book is the reason why I think that people should be able to read popcorn books and genre fiction and not have to feel bad about it, because this has a lot to it. And a lot of other stuff has a lot to it as well, but that is the one that I'll point to as the example. So in short, to conclude this video, I suppose, genre fiction still matters. Perhaps there are elements of certain genres within fiction that are too prevalent today and that are sometimes too prevalent in ways that might kind of suck. For example, there's romantasy, which can be apparently very hit or miss, and supposedly a lot of it's very bad, and even most of the people I know who actually unironically enjoy romantasy do call it trashy because it's trashy even though they enjoy it. So there are definitely cases to be made for certain genre fiction books and popcorn books and stuff that aren't really deeper, that aren't really serving whole much of a purpose besides just being trashy entertainment. But trashy entertainment can be good sometimes. We all have that one trash TV show that we just love to watch even though it sucks. I don't, because I don't watch TV, but I have my own trashy nonsense that I watch regardless, that nobody else would really appreciate, but I think it's just fun to turn my brain off to sometimes. We all have something like that, and don't pretend you don't. So yes, is there some trend chasing, and is there some actual drivel just masquerading as something interesting when maybe it's probably not? Sure. And in an age where self-pub, indie-published stuff, both good and bad, mind you, has completely flooded the market, there's room for plenty of that stuff to actually be really, really good, and a lot of that stuff to also be really, really bad. There's a lot to say for how broad a genre fiction is kind of oversaturated in the market today, but that doesn't really change the fact of the matter that to insist that all of it is garbage and stupid is really silly. Reading only literary fiction is also pretty silly. Ignoring general fantasy for magical realism, for example, is a really weird hill to die on because, fun fact, both of them have great books, and both of them have, things that are worth reading. A lot of the magical realism that I've read personally, I haven't really fully vibed with, but that doesn't mean that all those books were completely without worth, because they weren't. And same thing can be said for fantasy. And then returning to a broader point that I've made throughout the video, popcorn and stuff like that is also not inherently worthless. Even if popcorn books were never rich, even if there was never anything worth getting out of those books, which is absolutely not the case, that doesn't negate its place in the market, as I've kind of come to say. There's a reason that trash TV shows tend to be pretty popular, and sometimes it's because we just want to turn our brain off and consume nonsense just for comfort. And popcorn books can be like this, anything can be like this, and a lot of those books also have deeper meaning if you're looking for it and if you want to find it. Genre fiction and popcorn books are worth reading. Literary fiction and classic books are also worth reading. It is my opinion that you should read both because good books are everywhere. And that's going to wrap it up for today's video. It did turn out being a lot shorter than last week's. Thankfully, I appreciate you for watching this video if you did. If you missed last week's video, I highly recommend you also check that out. I would greatly appreciate it. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in whatever I upload next. But next Thursday, I've got another discussion video coming out that I'm pretty excited for, and I hope you guys are as well.